And welcome back. We are now entering our first segment of the show this morning. And as we said prior to the commercial break, today is the kickoff of the 16 Days of Activism. It is that time in November where we pay close attention. All right, and that being said, we have with us Dr. Sharmayne Saunders, who's in the middle. She's the president of Haven House. And to her right is the executive director of the National Women's Commission, none other than Cynthia Williams. And of course, to the far end is our good friend Aimee Jex, a counselor. Good morning, ladies.
Good morning.
Good morning.
16 Days of Activism and focus on gender-based violence. We do this every year to raise awareness on that particular issue. And it's a perennial and an ongoing concern of ours in our society. Where do we begin from this year? What do we have on the table for us to kickstart our 16 days?
Well, 16 days actually it's an opportunity to refocus, it's an opportunity to strengthen, to engage people that might otherwise not be engaged throughout the year, and to make new connections. I think particularly this year with the theme from awareness to accountability, unmasking the many faces of violence, it provides a space for us to expand the conversation, because a lot of times people speak about gender-based violence, but in their minds they only see domestic violence. And so it's important though for us to be able to continuously try to re-engage people and help them understand, because when we look at issues of gender-based violence, it's something that it is not only for families or it's only for interpersonal relationships between men and women, but it's something that affects communities. And I think it's that conversation that we need to be able to have. Sometimes it's uncomfortable conversations that we don't have, and I think this year it's really a challenge that we are taking out to the public, to the wider public, and with the theme is really looking at everybody's role, not only the role of some of us who work within the sector, but every single person that has lived, had experienced or not gender-based violence.
Now, when we talk about gender-based violence, I know you clearly said it, that the first thought is domestic violence, but it's also the first thought is women as a woman as the victim. But there's a very specific reason you use gender-based violence, because it includes men as well, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Now, with that out of the way, one of the things I wanted to look at is just taking stock of where we are. What kind of data do we have to really be able to understand as a baseline how we're doing in this country, how severe the problem is?
Our data, at least I have data from I think we started to actually register our victims that come to the house, the shelter. And from 1993 to 2018, we had 384 women and 865 children. Now, those are persons who stayed with us. Over the years, though, we've had over 1,200 women who came to us in emergency situations. So one of our strongest advocacy points is to ensure that we tell women how to do their exit plans. And that exit plan means there's an exit strategy in the case of an emergency. So they've already planned with their neighbors or their close friends how they will exit and come to us. And it may not be for the full 21 days that our residents stay with us. So those are our figures, and we also included in our strategic plan community outreach, because domestic violence is still very much taboo. It's not spoken about, and when we did our review, we realized too that we need to start from the beginning. So a lot of our programmatic areas focuses on dating violence. That's a start. On Saturday, we had a awareness raising event, which is called our 5K Color Run, a rather successful event. And what makes it more prideful for us is that we're seeing a lot of the younger people participating. Yes, it's a fun activity, and they may be amazed by the color and the powder. It kind of gives that sense of excitement. But it's also an opportunity for us to share. And we try to focus with the young people on dating violence, because that essentially can be where the problem starts.
As it relates, I think, to, and that's, I think, continues to be a challenge in Belize, as in many other Caribbean countries, the fact that we have not really established prevalence. And so we do have data on reported cases through the National Gender-Based Violence system, where any responder, any first responder dealing with any case of gender-based violence, and I say gender-based violence because it's not only domestic violence, it also includes sexual violence, sexual assaults as well. It also includes sexual violence, particularly children, and abuse of children. And so when it comes to that, we've been having some of that data. So the records that show that usually every year it ranges between 1,500 to over 2,000 cases, usually, and every year. There's like a decrease sometimes, and another year it goes up again. However, one of the things that we're working on is through the Belize Crime Observatory, looking at how do we begin ensuring that the data that is collected is much more structured. And so for us to then be able to use that for policy decisions. So the National Women's Commission, as an advisory body to government on issues of gender equality, that's one of the areas that we're trying to work on, and being able to look at what are the areas, because we know what are the limitations and what are the gaps. And so how do we strengthen those areas? Because we know that in many instances, not all the first-time responders actually document those cases. And so we don't really have the data to say this is the number. There was a pilot survey that was done back in 2015 through the UN Trust Fund project that looked at two specific areas, Stank Creek and Orange Walk. And so in there they were able to look at how many women experienced violence in terms at one point in their lives. So we definitely, that's one of the areas, that's one of the gaps that we need to be able to work on. And currently we're trying to see what are the spaces that we can utilize.
What was the indication in that particular case?
In that case, it was between 2 to 3 women have experienced violence at one point in their lives. And so, you know, it really requires a lot of funding for us to really invest in terms of a national survey or a study that allows us to have much clearer picture and more concrete data. However, we do have ways of collecting, but sometimes what happens is that we might not be collecting, or we might not be necessarily asking the necessary questions to be able to say, this is what we have. And so definitely we recognize that as a challenge, and to be able to then bring the different partners that work together and be able to then say, you as an agency collect this data, the other agency collects that, how do we group it and be able to get a clearer picture?
Yeah, you know, I asked the question about data because I think it's also, you know, there's responding to gender-based violence, which is where you look at the police, we look at agencies that you know, Sharmayne represents. But then there's also trying to understand the root of it and what we can do to circumvent the problem from taking place within households. Maybe that recognizing very early signs that a person may have a tendency to exhibit abusive behavior, or a person may have the tendency to allow abusive behavior. How do you go about, because I know you have year-round activities, and I know you talk with people all the time who come in difficult situations. What are some of the things that perhaps we need to start to mentally focus on with the younger generation, and even within ourselves if we haven't found ourselves in an abusive relationship?
I think the first thing we have to look for is just putting these things out there, having more awareness of what violence is, of what gender-based violence is, because what you spoke about in the beginning is very true. We see a lot of these things and we're so accustomed to it that we become jaded to it. So it's very important to start the conversation that certain things are not appropriate. One of the main indicators that we see is that we have experienced, maybe our parents or our neighbors. We hear the screaming, we hear the fear, and it's just what happens next door, what happens in the house. And this is normalized. So if I grew up my entire life seeing violence, then when it occurs to me, it's normal. And that is a truth in our society. It happens all over the world, not just in Belize. So it's very important to have these conversations. Like you said, it's a perennial issue, to keep it in the news and to keep the awareness going, so that whenever we encounter things like control issues, then we can start to place these control issues and see if it does relate to violence, if it does relate to, because to other things, because we see it as maybe abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. But what about financial abuse? When do we talk about that? If you have the money in the household and I make my own money, but when I have my own money, you're still in charge of paying all the bills and everything, so I have to give it to you. How do I formulate my exit plan? How do I formulate a safety plan?
Yeah.
When do I start saving my own money? When do I start making sure that I feel independent? It has to do with our self-esteem as well. It has to do with a lot of things wrapped up in where do we want our relationship? Is there respect in my relationship? And do I feel like I have a place in it?
Yeah.
Let's go back a bit. I'll go with an observation I think is commonplace here. In our society, you can say that for the most part, we're all interfering, right? You want to know what's happening with the next person. And so in an instance where there's the yelling and the screaming and the physical violence that you described, most of us would want to know or go by and say, hey, well, Aimee and man made a fight. But it doesn't dawn to us, you know what, let's call the police. Let's get somebody else involved because there's something happening there. It's more that you could say afterwards, girl, you may know so and so happened, as opposed to, you know, approaching it from the point that there is something happening that requires an intervention.
It ties in, and that's why I think we chose the particular theme, because it ties into the issue of accountability and a lack of seeing ourselves as having a responsibility or towards our neighbors, and a sense that we are also responsible for protection when it comes to children as well. And so it definitely speaks about taking it beyond. Important to keep that awareness, important to be able to bring the understanding of people to a higher level of what it really is. But how do we move from there? And I think that's the important step that we need. And slowly we're taking it. But I think this is where we need to have a more cohesive approach and be able to be more integrative in the things that we do. Because what often happens if we work in isolation. Sometimes everybody is doing all their different responses and their interventions, but it's because of the amount and the level of work that is required, we don't get that space and time to sit back and say, okay, this is what I found. It can inform what you are doing. And that way, then we can maybe come up with interventions that engage people at a higher level and say, you know what, as a citizen of Belize, as a citizen of Belize City, you have a personal responsibility to also report these cases. It's a moral responsibility. I mean, we are a very moral country. We are a very moral society. We speak about faith, and so when we talk about faith, we also have to say, well, we are our brother's keepers. So I think those are the conversations that often we kind of separate in some instances, and we need to bring them together. Because if we don't engage everybody, no matter how much work all the organizations do, it will still not be able to move beyond that.
And I think that's you know, what you're saying is important in terms of, I'm looking at Sharmayne's situation, where you would take women and their families when they're fleeing for their lives, essentially. And I'm sure they've shared many stories. They've probably had police encounters, neighbors or family intervening. What do you find to be the spark that makes them finally make the decision to break the cycle?
It's oftentimes an event that they feel that their children is at risk. They feel that the violence will then trickle, it will have a domino effect on the children, and that is what sparks them. But I also want to add from our statistics, 75% of our victims return to their situation. And maybe we have not spent enough time trying to figure out, because the structure that we have, we're not judgmental, and so they can return to us again. But we find that 75% of these women return. What is even a more serious implication and a double whammy in my view, sometimes they get out of the relationship, they're moving on, and when we track them, they end up with some serious illnesses. For example, we had a survivor who beat all odds, got out, got her children out, got them in school, and she was diagnosed with cancer. And so now she has a second battle. And then we're seeing that that is a trend, you know, that they get these diagnoses of terminal illnesses that whether or not there's a correlation between that, we really can't say. It's just how it has happened. And I think that is a double whammy. You fought your best fight, you're a survivor, and then you now have another battle that is out of your control as well.
Can
That's
we,
an interesting.
if we look at the statistics that you shared earlier, between 1993 and 2018, that is what, 25 years?
Yes.
Okay. So over the past 25 years, you've had just about or upwards of 1,200 persons who came to Haven House on an emergency basis.
Yes.
And 380 some odd persons who had their strategy and they came and sought
And the state.
and they stayed. Okay. Do you believe that perhaps the issue of pride, one, and two, the fact that gender-based violence in a sense is so very taboo that people suffer in silence and choose to do that rather than to expose what's really taking place in their lives or in their relationships, as to why they're not seeking the kind of assistance that they need? I ask that because 1,225 years seems nominal more than it is a reality that we know that is happening as we speak.
Absolutely. I think it's a composition of multiple factors. I'll tell you, for one, on our end, we are there only on a referral basis. And if you think about it, and right now in December, and there are some peak times that these incidences come to light. And I noticed particularly in December, in September, in Easter, whenever Easter falls, I don't know if it's linked to drinking, I don't know what. But
And also financial crunch.
yes, that's when we really have to have a guard up. And I go back to the referral process. You're referred to us, you don't come directly to us. And more now with social media, people want to come. I do a lot of the promotion of our Haven House on my personal page and the Haven House page. People come to my inbox all the time and they're afraid. And it's more fear than pride. I don't think it's pride.
Yeah.
I honestly believe it's fear over pride. And when they come in the inbox, it hurts my heart to say, I have to refer you to women's department. You need to talk to this person first. And then I think about it and I said, if I'm in a situation that is
Urgent
scary, risky, why do I have, you know, personally, I can't even take up the mantle and take the person to the shelter because it's not our process.
Okay, so why is it established in such a manner that it has to be based on a referral as opposed to immediate access or relief?
I speak only for Haven House, and it's because of the way we get our funding. We have to account. You see how quickly you have linked the amount of years and my data being nominal. That's the reason we began to collect data. A lot of our work has to be outcome oriented. It's programmatic, it's linked to funding. The bigger fishes dictate how you collect your data. That process is dictated as well. So there's a lack of flexibility in terms, if I reach out to somebody, I can do that personally and bring that person to my house, but the safety net is not necessarily there. It then impacts the safety of my family too. Because I have friends who do this type of advocacy work and they will take the women in, give them shelter, and that goes undocumented. But when you're in a system, they're all the I's have to be dotted, the T's have to be crossed, because at the end of the day, your data has to represent the work that you're doing as well.
And this is where it's important to be able to move beyond just the response. Because we need to be able to address what happens before. I don't think that we'll ever have enough resources at the government level. Even if we have all the NGOs here in Belize, we'll still not be able to have enough because people are not at that space. People have to be ready to be able to decide at one point, and we might never know exactly what makes them make the decision. For different people, it's different reasons. And that's the complexity of issues of gender-based violence. And so in terms of, and I don't want to focus only in terms of domestic violence, I want to be able to take the conversation farther than that, because it also speaks to why people also don't report sexual assault cases. It also speaks about families who willingly stand behind perpetrators of violence against their own children. The questions often that we ask is, why do women remain? Why do victims return? We have to ask the questions, why do batters batter? Why are people violent? And be able to then address that. When we look at issue of violence, it's about power and control. And so often when we have those incidents increasing, there are things that trigger perpetrators of violence to be able to exert their power and try to retain that control. And that's why we see incidents rising in specific moments. We have to look at other factors such as alcohol and the abuse of other drugs that are widespread in Belize. So definitely it's important to be able to make those linkages. And sometimes even agencies working in this sector do not make those linkages. And so we're, for the past at least year or so, I think more, we've been really trying to be able to look at what else needs to be done.
Yeah, that's my question, because the intervention work is expensive.
It is.
First of all, because you're giving people homes and everything else that comes along with it. It's based on an individual's choice to seek that those services. It's not like a child for human development to come in and extract them. If it's an adult, you need to have them willingly come out. And so the intervention work is always going to be, as you said, under-resourced. You just won't be able to meet the needs. So what are some of the other areas that we're trying to meet people at? What are the preventative measures? What are the early flag measures? What are we doing to not have to focus solely on, when people start playing Russian roulette with their life, like, if I stay, will I live beyond another day?
One of the things that we're trying to do through the National Gender and Gender-Based Violence Committee, it's looking at bring all the different sectors together to look at how this impacts individually on issues of education, issues of health, issues of security. We also have representation of the non-governmental sector as well, the UN agencies. And so we're doing that to be able to look at then what are the messages that are being sent in all these different sectors that can keep people, you spoke about a person having a choice. Sometimes people don't have that choice. They don't have the options. And so in terms of what are we also doing, what are the messages that we're giving both men and women, that when they get into these relationships, they'll be unable to say, you know what, that is violence, that is control, and that is not healthy, and be able to step away. And so we are not providing those messages very early on to children. Like what Aimee said, we've normalized violence to the most basic component, which is even with children. What do we tell girls? What do we tell boys in terms of how do we prioritize the needs? And so the issue of gender-based violence has to be done in so many levels. And so that is why often it is very difficult. You mentioned, in terms of awareness, often even in terms of the role of the media, the role of the church. And so it's like we're not really doing it to the best of what we can do.
May I ask an honest question here? When did control become a negative thing? And how far is control ought to go from it being having perhaps an authoritative or a supervisory role over a situation to versus manipulating altogether what the situation is?
I think you kind of clarified it there, because when we look at control, control is not necessarily a negative thing. You just have to be aware of respect in the relationship. So if you have control, let's look at it in a scenario of business, right? You have an employee, you are the boss. Are you a slave driver kind of boss? Or do your employees respect you and love you, and do they see that your work is balanced and everything is balanced out? It's the same thing in a relationship. It's the same thing in the schools. When we look at any kind of relationship, you want to see that the control is balanced, that you are not taking advantage of the other person. And sometimes we forget to see that there is that balance because we want to get to the bottom line. So it's important to learn to check in. When we look at these issues, you spoke about fear, you spoke about pride, there are these things involved. So why is there fear in our relationship, in any kind of relationship? When we look at the community approach, we are starting to have a little bit more education about bullying and anti-bullying campaigns in schools. So we start to see and we start to teach the younger generations, you don't speak like that, you don't address people like that, you don't take advantage of people in that manner. So in 15, 20 years, we'll see the results of these things. We'll see the results of adding meditation into the schools. But you can see from one school to another, and you've seen it in one part of the community to another. How do we speak to each other? How do we address each other? So when you look at sexual violence, emotional violence, you can start seeing that in how your partner addresses you. Does your partner address you with respect? Does your partner not? Does that person use language that is hurtful to you? Does your partner bully you? And do you realize that this is bullying, or do you feel like, well, this is how this person talks, you know? And so we have to realize that if you don't feel respect, or you don't feel like you have an opinion, or you cannot express yourself freely, you have to start second guessing at that point. And unfortunately, we have this history where we start not with domestic violence, but with partner violence. So people as young as first and second form are in emotionally abusive relationships. And so if your first relationship, you are getting called names, you are being disparaged, you are being told, you know, nobody else would go out with you because you're really ugly. And these kinds of harmful things, you grow up with that. So when your partner doesn't do that, it's outside of your norm. You become normalized to expect the violence. You become normalized to feeling like an obligation to do things within the relationship. And that's not what relationships are, but who knows that?
I wanted to just clarify though, because I think the employer-employee relationship would be distinctly different from a relationship between two people, because wouldn't they, I mean, ideally you come into a relationship as equals. An employer has a different power structure over you. So the issue of controlling behavior, I think my question is looking at, it starts almost subliminal, doesn't it? Like you don't realize you're being controlled until you start to exhibit those feelings of fear. Like maybe I can't post this online because it'll get my partner upset, or maybe I can't talk to Isani because you know my partner is watching,
or you know I can't play this kind of music because it reminds my partner of when we were in this bad relationship. It's even those little things. I can't cook this food, I can't wear this outfit. It's looking at those rules that you have taken on that are unspoken rules, that are things that are limiting you.
Or sometimes told by the partner too.
Exactly. And that's the point that I wanted to, you know, in terms of whenever we talk about control, we have to look at it as once it violates a person's rights, then we already begin to see it is wrong. I see control often as a way of retaining that power. And so in of itself, control is mostly almost 100% negative because it's used to retain that power. One, we are talking about messages and we're talking about what we say. Those messages have been handed to us, and that's where the gender aspect of it comes in, with the socialization and how we are bringing up men and women, and what are the things that we tell them, and that kind of causes us to accept certain things within relationship, because it is the expectation that that's how each of them should behave. In terms of men, if they're more in touch with their own feelings, and they're, you know, it's not seen as something that is very manly. In terms of women, you know, it's a sense of submissiveness and lack of power to make their own decisions because they're seen as the weaker sex. So those are the types of messages at the very bottom that we often don't even know when we're actually exhibiting
Yeah.
them. And then it kind of permeates relationships.
Yeah.
And when we are unable to communicate with one another, when we're unable to accept that that person is an independent person who can make their own decisions. I don't like them, I don't agree with them, but that's their own decisions, and as adults we need to respect that. That's where the violence comes in, because it has to retain that power and control.
Go ahead.
A lot of, I go back to corporal punishment and the acceptance. And I can say this from studies that I've done, research. I remember doing a research for violence against children. And kids told us in those, we did countrywide, you know, it's acceptable if your mother curses you, your dad. If I do something wrong, I should get spanking.
Yeah.
It got even more alarming when I did a study for, it wasn't just particularly for violence, but as a part of the study I had to do that. And I remember talking to grown women, and they say, if food wasn't on the table and my husband hits me, that's acceptable, you know, it's okay. And so I was one of the most enlightened persons when I did those studies, but I also looked at corporal punishment when it was in schools, and I said, they took it out, they didn't replace it with something effective.
Yeah.
When I became a parent, I made a conscious decision. I grew up being told, you know, they curse you, and it was acceptable. Your neighbors heard it, nobody worried.
Yeah.
Nobody worried. And I made a conscious decision because I was educated, I understood, I learned about classical conditioning, all the fancy things you did in psychology. I teach sociology. And I said, no, I'm going to try this differently. But I also realized it was a decision I had to make with my husband. How are we going to parent? Because both of us came from families that were upstanding, but we both learned, we knew punishment, and we did well.
Yeah.
But what were we going to accept for ourselves? And so we had to sit down and parent. I don't think a lot of people sit down and talk about parenting. That's stupid.
Yeah.
It's as silly as telling somebody go to counseling. If a man and a woman has a quarrel and you tell him go do some counseling, like, why do I need to go? We're not Americans. We're believing all that.
There's this notion that only crazy people seek that kind of assistance.
So at 16, I have a 16-year-old daughter, and you know, a lot of people still criticize how we parent. She's allowed to speak up. And I always tell my daughter, you can say whatever you want, but do it respectfully.
With respect.
Yes, and you're listened. She's acknowledged in her peers. She's acknowledged by the teachers because she does. But it had to be a decision. Yes, I can say I didn't grow up like that. My husband was used to spanking for everything. He couldn't even say something in his family. So we learn and we don't replicate. And a lot of times people are in situations because they don't have the information, they replicate what they know. That's all they know. They've been conditioned to do that, and that's all they know. And we have not touched that part of it.
Yeah.
We're fixing the surface. We are seeing the results of all of that, and we go and treat that part of it.
It's a deep-seated issue.
And I think that is, thank you, because that's going to lead us into our next segment. And so we'll take a quick break, but I think it really is important for us to explore some of the beliefs and values that we have as a society that is contributing to the problem that we see with gender-based violence. So we'll take a break, and we're going to attempt to tackle that in the next segment. Please stay tuned.